But their theory of implied malice murder is that there has to be a number. There is a speed at which that alone equals implied malice. And that is ridiculous. We do not define under Watson, or Watson is the case, as you know, that can, in certain very limited circumstances, bring an implied malice murder to a vehicular manslaughter case, to a case involving the death of an individual vis-a-vis a car accident.
I look at this and I say, this is not Brian Kohberger, okay? And I know it's just not Brian Kohberger. This kid was not drinking, no drugs, no alcohol. He had the same car I think I read for like 5 years, never a speeding ticket. And I look at this, and yes, I know the loss. Again, just like you, I am a mother. We are parents. My husband's lost a child. We know what it's like to be in a situation where you lose a child. But there's a time that the law has to step in, and 16 hours to decide again that this is malice murder. It's just not it. Where's the reconstruction? I want to see that first. I want to see everyone interviewed. I want to see the tapes again. But that's just me talking. Podcaster out here in New York City.
Jacqueline, let me ask you a couple questions. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. I'm from California. I've been on that road many times. Horrible road in general. PCH. It's beautiful, but there's a lot of distractions that begin with the Grand Pacific Ocean, and I think that contributes to how dangerous that road is. How is that going to factor into this case, do you think, for the defense, and how, if at all, will the prosecution use that?
So PCH is notorious for being a dangerous road.
What is it? Can I ask what it is for people that
Pacific Coast Highway, which is number one. And it's the road that takes you to Malibu. You go across the canyons, either Topanga. I was off Laurel Canyon myself. So it's that road that is as far west as you can be without being in the ocean. And you've seen all those $10 million homes right along the road there. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me this evening. PCH, Pacific Coast Highway, is known notoriously as a very dangerous road. And there are certain parts of PCH that are more dangerous than others. And in particular, there's one stretch of roadway that is at issue in this case, literally called Dead Man's Curve. And you can actually pull what's called Switter's reports, which are reports of other accidents that have been reported on that exact stretch of roadway. And you'll find that in a 0.8 mile distance, that there have been dozens and dozens of accidents, as well as fatal accidents on that exact stretch of roadway. And none of those people who were involved in those accidents were ever charged with murder. And in some of those cases, there'll be instances where the driver will be intoxicated, speeding, committing conduct that is far more egregious than what our client did. And even in those cases, they're not charged with murder, but rather they're charged with vehicular manslaughter. And so in this case, it's important to point out that in a murder case, you have to show that the defendant subjectively knew that what he was doing was going to cause great bodily injury or death to another person. And by showing all of these other accidents that have occurred, and how if all of these other people are getting into these accidents and they're not being charged with murder, our client should not be either. And so it's
so
the road is.
To dovetail onto Jackie's point, I think it's important for your viewers to understand what implied malice murder requires, at least in California. It requires two things. Number one, an act. The first thing is the act whose natural and probable consequences involve a high probability of, now listen to the end of this sentence, whose natural and probable consequences involve a high probability of death, not high probability of great bodily injury, but of death. So they must prove that the act itself has a natural and probable consequence of which is that it involves a high probability of death. And number two, the second prong is that the proof that there has to be proof that the defendant in this case actually appreciated that death level risk in the circumstances and then consciously disregarded that death level risk. And they say, going at a particular speed, they don't define the speed. They haven't defined the speed. They won't say, well, it's 98 or 96 or 97 or 104 or 73. They don't define a speed. They just say, Judge, just variably, there's a speed above which we meet the threshold for implied malice murder. And it's just not true, Linda. It's just not true. They don't have a case that they can point to like this that's ever been prosecuted as a murder. The Watson murders always include, if they're based on speed in any way, shape, form, or fashion, they always include another factor: speed and you're drunk, speed and you're racing, speed and you're street demonstrating, meaning the drifting and going in circles and street racing and such. Speed and you're on drugs. Never, to our knowledge, never in the history of the district attorney's office have they ever charged speed alone as the conduit to murder. And our question is, are you, and it is a valid question. Our question to the DA's office is, are you using emotion rather than law as the determining factor for your charging decision in this case? And I get the emotion. I get it. There's a reason, and I've said this before, there is a reason why we don't allow in this country private prosecutions. Back in the old days, back in England, before we came to this country, before we had a constitution, there were such things as private prosecutions. You were lord of a manor, someone offended you by stealing a horse or cattle or something, and you got to prosecute that person. Well, the reason we don't allow that is because it necessarily involves bias and emotion, and it takes all objectivity away. And I fear that in this case, that objectivity has been lost because of the devastating emotion of the 4 lives lost, which are devastating. But the two things have to exist on separate planes. One is we grieve and are horrified by the loss and the devastation for these victims and these families. On the other side of it is, what is the conduct that we are criminalizing? It is not murder.
And then one of the things I wanted to ask, actually 2 things with regard to that. It would seem under the prosecution's theory that if you have an accident that involves a death on there, and we know there's been some high-profile individuals that have had accidents that involve death in that,
and never been charged with murder.
Never been charged with murder. Isn't it that any speed then would be dangerous? So what do you selectively pick the speed of this kid for some reason because of the amount of people that were huddled together? I also think that they got a problem, Alan, with the reconstruction. I looked at the pictures. I think I mentioned
it exists.
Right.
There is no reconstruction.
There is no reconstruction before this charge. No. And even if you look at the pictures, what they're saying happened doesn't comport with the pictures of Fraser's car, if I may call it Fraser. All right. And that's just, I looked at that in preparation to try to prepare for my interview of you. I don't see it. So who decided that it's going to be just the speed? And because you have cars that are parked there. Maybe they shouldn't have been parked there. You have something chasing him, he says. I kind of believe him after I look at and read the probable cause hearing, which you did not do, or the preliminary hearing, I guess you call it in California. Right. You call it the preliminary hearing, which you did not do. That, when we look at it as lawyers, usually in for instance, murder cases, and somebody says, I saw somebody at that scene, and it turns out that the murderer is really the person who's the witness. I get a little antsy when I'm looking at that. Man. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just saying that that's out there in this case.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the question to your very pointed, the answer to your very pointed question is, who did the reconstruction? Nobody did the reconstruction. We've gotten all the evidence. They never did a formalized reconstruction. A reconstruction, an accident scene reconstruction, vehicular homicide reconstruction is a very, very, very specific thing. It's a specific animal. There are professionals out there who do it. There's protocols to follow. There are formula to follow. And none of that was done in this case. I think what happened was, like I said, I think emotion took over. They had these 4 young ladies who were deceased. They had a young man who they could say, they could put him behind the wheel, and they said, King's X, you're done. you're done. And we're going to charge these as homicides in no small part. And by the way, it was not this DA. The sitting DA here, Nathan Hochman, was not the person who was in charge when this case was filed. It was a guy named George Gascone. And there's all kinds of political reasons why George Gascone, I believe, decided to charge this case as it was charged. He was in the middle of a very, very heated political campaign in which he was being accused of being soft on crime. I mean, that was the real campaign slogan that Nathan Hochman was using to really define George Gascone. Well, what was the best way that he could in October 2023? What was the best way that he could bat that back and battle against that accusation? Let's charge Fraser Bohm with 4 counts of murder. How about that for being soft on crime? And Fraser's having to carry that water because of George Gascone's decision, which I believe, in my heart of hearts, was a political decision. And none of the hard data supports it. Even the EDR data. They downloaded data using an outdated CDR, an outdated Bosch program that was literally in the download said that we are limited in our data analysis. We, the downloading software, we can only do so much. We're very limited in the analysis that we can undertake. And that's where they get the speed that they claim was 104 miles an hour, which they now are sort of questioning because their own expert at that probable cause hearing, the preliminary hearing, admitted that when the wheels come off the ground, that can badly distort that very EDR data that they're now relying on. There's lots and lots of problems with this case that could have and should have been resolved by the prosecution, by their own investigation. But now we're having to do that, and it's coming at extreme cost to us, not just financial cost, but just labor cost for us to do. But we're going to do it. We're going to get to the truth of the matter, and we're going to fight against these murder charges until we don't have a breath left in us. If this case, and I've said this before as well, if this case were charged as what it should be, a manslaughter case, vehicular manslaughter case, I'll defend that all day long. What I don't want is to have an inappropriate legal argument propounded by the prosecution. Prosecution's a behemoth. The government, especially here in Los Angeles, they're a behemoth. There is no resource they don't have. They're massive. They're massive. And Fraser is having to fight at this point against 4 charges that just do not hold. They are not legal charges. And that's the scary part of this case.
Alan, you answered my first question, and that was the Gascone versus Hochman, right? Totally different philosophies, and we know Gascone got blown out of the water, and he's no longer a factor. Has there been any contact with the new DA, Mr. Hochman? Has there been any approach by his office to do something with this case?
Not personally. I have not spoken with Nathan Hochman, about this at all. There may come a time when we ask for an audience with Mr. Hochman. That hasn't happened yet. I don't like to do anything sort of half baked. I want to make sure that I have as much information at my fingertips as possible before I do suggest such a meeting. And if such a meeting is in order, which I think very likely it will be, I would expect that Nathan Hochman would accept that audience and at least sit down and listen to me. That's what he's known for doing. He's known as being very reasonable, and my hope is that he sort of follows that same protocol with us in this case.